Hey! Hi, I'm Murphy Griffin.
And I'm Madison Taylor. And welcome to episode 6 of Newfoundland Boatwrights. In the last episode, we started the lofting with our grid work and profile outline.
And in this episode, we're going to complete the lofting board that you see here and give you in-depth instruction on how to do it yourself. So, let's get to it.
So before we actually begin lofting the rest of the boat, we wanted to give you guys a bit of an overview as to what we'll be doing in the episode and why it's important. Last episode we lofted the profile outline, and that's a really great place to start because not only does it give you a good visual representation of what the boat's going to look like, it acts as a place where a lot of the lines that we'll be lofting will actually terminate, and it's necessary to know where those lines are going to end before you make them.
So moving forward from the profile outline, we'll be lofting the station lines, the buttock lines, and the water lines. Now we've come to believe that not all lines are created equal. It's really all about the station lines. So remember that the water lines and the buttock lines won't actually show up on the boat. We won't make anything with them. Whereas the station lines will actually dictate the shape of the molds, which are really important in determining the shape of the boat. That being said, the water lines and the buttock lines have their roles to play and are important tools in refining the curvature of the station lines. And so you must loft them, there's no avoiding it. Now there are other things that need to be lofted as well. We need to loft the stem, we need to loft the keel, and we need to loft the transom. But we're going to hold off talking about all those things until we go to make them in future episodes.
So there's a definite order of operations to your lofting. The first lines you're going to want to loft are your station lines. These are the curvy lines in your body plan. Next, move to the water lines, which are the lines in your half breadth. And then finally, you can loft the buttock lines, the lines in the profile view. Now, if you've accidentally started somewhere besides the station lines, that's okay. We made that exact same mistake by lofting the water lines first. Just remember that pretty much any mistake can get fixed. Just take your time, be careful, and you've always got an eraser, so you can give it another shot.
So one of the things you're going to notice when you go to loft your different sets of lines, your station lines, your water lines, and your buttock lines, is that you're given most of the information you need to plot each individual line from your table of offsets. One thing you're not given, however, is the termination points for each line. And unfortunately, for each different set of lines, you're going to have to find those termination points on your own, and the process for doing that is different for each different set. So first, we're going to loft our station lines, and we're going to show you the process for finding the termination points of your station lines. When you look at your table of offsets, you'll notice that they're split into two different tables of measurements, your half breadths and your height above base. Your half breadths basically equate to the X coordinates in your body plan, and your heights above base are the Y coordinates. Now you'll notice that we actually have the measurements to loft one of our termination points, the shear. What we're missing is measurements to loft the bottom termination point, where the line meets the keel. So if you recall, the Newfoundland Trap Skiff has a trapezoidal plank keel, and we intend on building the keel as per the design. So what we have here is a cross-section of the keel at station 3 drawn to scale. There's two really important dimensions in this drawing. One is the overall thickness of the keel, which is 1 3/4 inch, and one is the thickness of the shoulder of the keel, which is 5/8 inch. So if you take the cross-section of the keel, you'll notice that we've drawn in two reference lines, the center line and the rabbit line. All you need to do is line up the center line with the actual center line on your lofting, and the rabbit line with the rabbit line on your lofting. Definitely take the time to make sure it's as lined up and perfect as you can get it. And then go ahead and take down the drawing. So with the cross section in position, we can go ahead and loft all of the measurements and points that are given to us in the table of offsets.
Okay, so now with your nails up, you can go ahead and spring the batten. So now that we've sprung the batten, you'll notice that we don't have any information from the table of offsets as to where the batten's actually supposed to end, where it's supposed to terminate. That's where this cross section comes into play. So you want your termination point to be at the top of the bevel, right there. And the reason for that is where the actual mold is going to end. And ultimately, for the fairness of the line, you would like the batten to follow the bevel. And we can sort of make sure that this is in place by just putting in another nail and putting the batten up right against it. And there you go, you have found the termination point for station line 3. All right, so with that done, you can follow the exact same procedure for every other station line. You'll make your cross section, you'll loft it, and you'll find your termination point.
So following the procedure that Madison laid out, we start by drawing cross sections of the keel at each of the 5 stations seen in the body plan view. Each of these cross sections is a trapezoid in shape. With the cross sections, we can now loft the 5 station lines. We start by plotting the offsets and placing nails at each of the offsets, but now we'll use the cross section of the keel to figure out the termination point at the bottom of the line. We then repeat this process 4 more times to get all 5 of our station lines, each time plotting the given offsets, placing nails at the plotted points, and then with a batten and the cross section of the keel, determining the termination point at the bottom of the line, and then lofting the entirety of the line. We then went ahead and lofted the shear line, connecting the first 3 station lines in the forward part of the boat. This isn't a very useful line to loft, but it's nice to see. We then proceed by lofting station 4 and station 5 on the left-hand side of the center line, where the first line you see there is a mirror copy of station line 3 that also appears on the right-hand side of center line. Each time following the exact same procedure: offsets, batten, cross section, line. With station 4 lofted, we now loft station 5. Something very interesting happens when we're lofting station 5. As you'll notice, the second to the last nail up above cannot be faired into the curve. So we ultimately have to abandon the offset in favor of a fair curve. This is something you're supposed to anticipate when it comes to lofting. The good news is that even if this ends up being a mistake, if you're following the lofting process correctly, then the lofting will correct the mistake itself, so to speak. Finally, to conclude the lofting of the body plan, we're lofting the transom in the body plan view. This is not the final lofting of the transom, however, since the view of the transom in the body plan view is slightly squashed thanks to the fact that the transom is projecting out at an angle from the back of the boat. It's still useful to loft this view of the transom, however, because it'll prove useful in expanding the final shape of the transom that we'll use to make the template. So with the station lines lofted, we can now move on to the water lines and the buttock lines. Now some of you may be asking, why did we loft the station lines first? Couldn't we have done the water lines with the buttock lines? And the answer is kind of, maybe, but there is a good reason to start with the station lines. So the advantage of starting with the station lines is that you have more information to initially use when you are fairing in these curves. You're actually using all of the offsets all at once. both the heights above base and the half breadths are all used in the station lines. Whereas with the water lines or the buttock lines, you're only using one of those sets of offsets. So one of the central tenets of lofting is that you only make a measurement once. Once you've made that measurement, you then use a tick stick to carry that measurement around the board. So suppose that we wanted to loft waterline 12, which is represented by this horizontal grid line right here. So recall that the water lines in the body plan view are actually the straight horizontal grid lines. So there's a direct correspondence between the horizontal distance measured off the center line in the body plan view and the vertical distance measured off the baseline in the half breadth view, where the baseline is actually functioning as a center line in the half breadth view. In this animation, you'll see a small cursor that's tracing out the horizontal grid line in the body plan view that's synchronized with a similar cursor that's tracing out the curved water line in the half breadth view. You can see that when they both cross the same station line, that they blink red at the same time. This should illuminate one of the ways in which the body plan and the half-breadth view relate to one another. And it's this relationship that we'll be taking advantage of in this tick stick procedure that's to follow. So we'll align the tick stick with the horizontal grid line that represents waterline 12. Then we'll make a mark for the center line that we'll use to realign the tick stick when we use it elsewhere on the board. And then we'll track along this horizontal grid line, and every time we encounter a station line, we'll make a tick. So we track, and then here we make a tick. So we're going to use these offsets that we picked up on the tick stick to generate all the necessary half breadths we need to plot waterline 12. So what we do is pick up this tick stick, and then we'd go to the respective station, realign the tick stick at that station, and transfer the mark. So again, the main idea is that we no longer need to take any measurements. We are simply going to transfer measurements using a tick stick from one part of the board to the other part of the board. So using the tick stick procedure, we're able to transfer all of the half breadths that we need to plot our water lines. We can then place nails at all of those plotted offsets and then spring a batten across those nails to give us the smooth curves of our water lines. Special care does need to be taken when lofting the water lines. Since they are such long, smooth curves, you want to make sure that you use a thick batten that will take those curves well. If the batten's too loose, you won't get a fair curve. With the batten in place, now we have to figure out what the forward termination point is. There's still a degree of freedom here. So we've sprung a batten for our second water line, and now we're trying to determine where the termination point of this water line is with respect to the half siding of the stem. We projected down the intersection of the stem or profile line with the same water line in the profile perspective. We line the batten up with that projection intersection. If we were to loft this line with the batten in this particular location, this would be incorrect, because our lofting, as specified by the designer, is to the inside of the planking, and currently our batten is in position with the outside of the planking. We need to figure out where it would be with respect to the inside of the planking. In order to do this, we're going to use this handy dandy plank gauge. This plank gauge is approximately the width of the planking that we're going to be using to plank up the boat. So what we do is we line up the batten with the projection intersection on the stem half siding, and then we run the plank gauge along the batten. Since the plank gauge is approximately the width of the planking, wherever the plank gauge crosses the stem half siding is going to give us a pretty good indication of where the inside of the planking would meet the stem. So we run it up along the batten, and then make a mark where the plinth gauge crosses the stem half siding. Wherever the intersection is between these two marks is going to be where the inside of the planking meets the stem half siding, and therefore where the termination point is for our water line. Once we know where this mark is, we're just going to shift up our batten so that it lines up with that mark, and now we can loft the sucker. In this way, we can find the forward termination point for all of our water lines. And since the aft termination point was provided in the table of offsets, this is all the information we need to loft all of our water lines. As with the body plan view, we also lofted the transom in the half-breadth view. The view of the transom in the half-breadth view is even more squashed than it was in the body plan. But this will still prove useful in expanding the transom for the final template. Finally, to conclude the lofting of the half-breadth view, we lofted the inboard and outboard dimensions of the keel. This will be used directly to make a template to help us get the final shape of the keel. And so with the half-breadth view completely lofted, we can move on to the buttock lines. As with the water lines, when lofting the buttock lines, we'll also be using a tick-stick procedure. The only difference is that when we line up our tick-stick initially, we line it up with a vertical grid line instead of a horizontal grid line. We then transfer all those ticks to the respective stations and connect those dots to get our buttock line. But the tick-stick procedure only covers the interior offsets for our buttock line. We yet again need to figure out what the termination points are. So now that we already have the station lines and the water lines lofted, we're going to make sure as we add buttock lines that they remain consistent with the information we've already lofted. And for that reason, we're going to use the water lines to help us figure out the termination points for our buttock lines. So here you see a simplified picture that will help us understand the relationship between the buttock lines and the water lines. Now there are two important pairs of lines present here. One is the buttock line, whose termination points we're trying to figure out, along with the horizontal grid line that corresponds directly to this buttock line. The other pair is the shear line, both seen in the half-breadth and profile view. Since, as you can see, both termination points for the buttock line occur on the shear line, what we're interested in is the intersection in the half-breadth view between the grid line that corresponds to our buttock line and the shear line. As you can see, the shear line in the half-breadth view intersects the grid line in two different places. Taking the forward intersection point first, what we're going to do is project that point up to the shear line seen in the profile view. Then we'll do the same with the after intersection point. Where these projections intersect the shear line in the profile view correspond to the termination points of our buttock line. In fact, we can use this same process to not only find the termination points for our buttock line, but to also gain further refinements to its shape. We do this by first fixing the horizontal grid line that corresponds to the buttock line that we're trying to loft. We then take each individual water line and its corresponding horizontal grid line. We find the intersection of the water line with the grid line that corresponds to our buttock line, and then project those intersections up or down to the grid line that corresponds to our water line. Where those projections land should correspond to points on our buttock line. Should is the operative word here. This is in fact where we started encountering the most issues with consistency within our lofting. Whatever errors surface here in this projection process are very likely to be areas where you'll have to spend some time making corrections to your lofting. Theoretically, you're not actually done lofting until this sort of projection process that you can perform between any two views is entirely consistent. So we can put nails down for each of these additional points and then spring all the battens and loft all the buttock lines. And so with that done, all the major lines have been lofted. All we have to do is make a few corrections and we can start working on the boat. Once the lines are down on the lofting board, the hard work really begins. Because theoretically, all of these different views of the boat, these three different views, have to agree with one another. So where two lines intersect in one view, they must intersect in a similar place in another view. And this must be true for any pair of lines that intersect in a particular view. All these intersections have to be cross-checked to make sure that they're consistent with one another. So making a lofting correction is essentially locating a place where the intersections don't agree between two different views and then changing the lines to force those intersections to agree. But what's worse is that you have to pursue all of the ramifications of making those changes to the lines. So while it'd be nice to have a perfect lofting, there's really no need to go to all the trouble of making sure everything is consistent. What you're really concerned with is what sort of corrections will result in a change in the station lines, which in turn change the shape of the molds. So the main idea is that you get the lofting as perfect as you need to in order to get all the refinement to the station lines that is necessary. It really just has to be good enough for you to build your boat. So we're finally done lofting!
At least for now.
Okay.
There's still a few other things that we're going to use the lofting board for, but we'll show you guys that stuff when we get to it. Obviously, lofting is pretty complicated and takes a long time, but I really hope that these few episodes shed some light on the process. It's going to make your life easier when you actually get to lofting your own boat.
So in episode 7, we're finally going to get down to building the boat. We're going to be going to Cornwall, Connecticut and paying a visit to New England Naval Timbers, where we'll be getting all the white oak we need for our keel, our stem, and our stern posts, as well as have a long chat with the head sawyer and longtime owner, Duke Basozi.
He is easily one of the last sawyers specializing in wooden boats in America. And this is the kind of content that we want to keep bringing you guys. There's a lot of people out there like that we would love to go see, and we think it's very important to hear from them. But in order to do that, we have to keep the project funded, and we could really use your support to keep the ball rolling.
So on that note, we have 2 new patrons. Much thanks to Nick Donahue
and David Posner.
Thanks y'all. Bye.
Oh, what's this nugget? I'll just eat it right up.